Okay, well, I am going to pretend that this is something resembling an actual meet and greet sort of house party, such as political candidates used to have back in the pre-COVID age,
Yeah.
and therefore begin with just a little bit of chit chat. So, what do you guys want to talk about?
Economics.
Economics.
Yeah.
Okay. Um, what what's your take on the current situation, Bill?
With actually in the Trump organization, or with you talking about things going on with beautiful, I would say our good friends down in downtown Tucson, like Steve Christie and his take on.
Whatever slant you want to put on it.
Let's hear what Christie has going or not going for him.
Yeah. Well, I recently started watching a um, a video that Christie has a Republican primary opponent, um, and they let's see, a Republican LD14 organization held a debate between Christie and Backer last week, and I started watching it. Backer posted it on YouTube, and Christie was just so consistent with his previous positions. Of course, he would be consistent with his previous positions during this pandemic. Whenever he's spoken about it, he's always favored less regulation on business. Say we can trust businesses to self-regulate. It's in their interests. And, at the same time, we're seeing nightclubs and bars packed with people without masks, even after the mask regulation was enacted by Pima County and by the city of Tucson. So he seems to feel that it is primarily an economic issue, speaking of economics, rather than primarily a public health issue. And while I acknowledge that there are a lot of um, potential nuances there, um, how many lives is it worth to keep 10 restaurants from failing? How do you even begin to calculate that kind of equation? So to me, my values say we have to put public safety, public health first.
What about him talking personal freedoms and this other line that our good friends in Phoenix, the Republicans, are talking about? Whether or not it's against my First Amendment rights or some kind of nonsense they're talking about.
Yeah, and um, I've never heard anyone object to no shoes, no shirt, no service on First Amendment grounds.
Mm-hmm.
And yet, all we're trying to do at the moment, I think we should be doing more, but all we're trying to do at the moment is add no masks, no shoes, no shirt, no service to the requirements that businesses enforce. I think that's a pretty simple and clear way of thinking about it. It doesn't, my right to shout fire, my First Amendment right to free speech ends with the right to shout fire in a crowded theater when there is no fire, right? The
Correct.
famous Supreme Court ruling from the early 20th century, I believe. And well, Bill, remind me again to talk about economic issues in a larger context a little later. Would you?
Okay. No
Thanks. Because
problem.
for now, I'd like to launch into the solo presentation portion of the proceedings and just give a brief introduction to myself and why I'm running. And then also, I'm going to play a short YouTube video that I made a couple of weeks ago that zeroes in on what the important things I think are in this election. So,
Okay.
to begin with, I'm Steve Diamond. I was born and raised in New York City, the grandson of immigrant. Bill, would you mute yourself, please?
Sure. Sorry.
That's okay.
Running around here. Just got back.
There you go. Thanks. I'm the grandson of an immigrant who actually came over at age 2, I think my grandfather was, in the 1890s, when my great-grandfather Solomon brought him and several of his brothers and their mother over to the US to escape the anti-Semitic pogroms happening in Romania at the time. And knowing this family history has deeply informed my response to any of the immigration issues that we're seeing now, and in particular to the treatment of immigrants in general and of refugees in particular. And that leads me to how I first got involved in Pima County politics, because until 2018, I, like many voters that I speak to, that I've spoken to during the campaign, I was only very vaguely aware that there even was a Pima County government. Living in the city of Tucson, I mostly knew about the city government. I didn't know much of anything about the county government. And when, as an activist, I first started to visit the Board of Supervisors meetings, I first had to look up who my actual supervisor was. I didn't know what Supervisor District I was in or who my supervisor was. But as part of the effort that was started primarily by the immigrant community in Tucson and in Pima County to stop the Pima County Sheriff's Office from accepting any more federal grants under Operation Stone Garden, which require the Sheriff's Department, our Pima County Sheriff's Department, to collaborate with U.S. Border Patrol in apprehending immigration law violators. It seems very clear to me that that should not be a function of the local sheriff's department, especially as study after study has shown that when immigrant communities become distrustful of local law enforcement because they believe, in this case rightfully so, that local law enforcement is collaborating with immigration authorities like Border Patrol and ICE, then these communities, members of these communities, become less likely to report crimes, and the overall community safety suffers for everybody, not just for the immigrant communities, because criminals are less likely to be found and apprehended when crimes aren't reported. So that public safety argument was only one of the many arguments against the Operation Stone Garden grants, but I felt it was one that was compelling and had broad community appeal because it talks about the overall safety of the community. There are many other grounds, many of them moral, and many of them having to do with racial profiling, racial discrimination, many other grounds for not wanting to accept those federal grants. But the public safety one is one that I chose to emphasize, again, for the reasons that I stated. Community safety, I think, is very important. So that's how I got involved in county politics. I started going to all the meetings. I got fascinated by what they do there. I started building relationships with some of the supervisors, especially the Democratic ones. And well, I had what I considered a very special relationship with the late Richard Elias, whose death I mourn deeply. He was a great friend, and he was a great supporter of mine. He was probably my biggest fan in terms of running for this office. I was so looking forward to the opportunity of working with him if I should be elected. And it's such a sad thing that he died so young. Um, I may say more about him a little later. So that was my involvement with county politics, and I quickly realized that uh, building relationships with the supervisors and lobbying them directly, personally, one-on-one, and in groups with other activists can only go so far. You know, citizen lobbyists have a certain influence, and certainly more influence in local politics, like county politics, than in federal politics or even state politics. But it only goes so far, and I felt that the next step, if I wanted to really serve the community, was to run for this office, especially as District 4 has been in Republican hands, Supervisor District 4, since it was first created in the expansion from 3 to 5 county supervisors in 1972. It has always been held by a Republican. The last time a Democrat even ran for this seat was in 1996. That's 24 years ago. So I thought it was high time. Now, there's a reason for that. It's a Republican district. There's a Republican majority among active voter registrations, but the demographics have been changing rapidly. The gap in registration is down by, well, at least half over the last couple of years. And between that change in voter registrations and the possibility of a very strong backlash against the terrible Republican governance that we've seen at every level recently, I think that there is a real chance to flip this seat this year, which is why I'm doing this. I wouldn't be in it if I didn't think I could win it. So from New York, I moved to Tucson in 1971. I graduated from the University of Arizona in 76 with a degree in music. And I immediately resumed the career that I had interrupted when I left New York, which was in information technology. I was in the corporate world, a computer programmer, software department manager, software architect, and eventually chief information officer. And in those roles, you know, one has to know a lot of detail about how pieces of businesses fit together, how they work together, how businesses are structured. So I think I have a great background for understanding how a complex operation like Pima County operates, and for being able to understand the issues involved and to help it to run smoothly and efficiently, and also to set effective progressive policy. Returning for a moment to my great grandfather in New York, I learned recently that he was a leader in the early 20th century. He became a leader in the Jewish labor movement in New York. And I was tickled pink to discover that, because I've worked closely with organized labor here in Tucson for the last couple of years on many common causes, because I feel that labor values are community values, are family values, and are the kinds of values that we need to amplify. Values like integrity, equity, inclusiveness, and truly lifting each other up, looking out for one another, regardless of anyone's background or anyone's circumstances. And those are the kinds of values for which I wish to be a champion on the board. And those are not ideologies. I'm pragmatic. I'm not driven by progressive ideologies, liberal ideologies, conservative ideologies, none of those. I want to get things done, and I want people's lives to be improved, and I want to hold the common good above everything else. And this is where I have a stark contrast with my presumptive opponent, Mr. Christie, because he is consistently, as we were giving an example of earlier, driven by conservative ideology without really giving an ounce of consideration to the details and the realities of those situations. So what else did I want to say? I'm going to stop the solo part at that point, except for this, to say, let me need my glasses for this part. I'm told that the right way of doing this kind of meeting is to ask early and often for campaign donations. And frankly, I hate asking people for money for my campaign, but the reality of the situation is that political campaigns these days need money in order to run, need money in order to survive. So I'm going to paste a link to a donation page into both the Facebook Live comments and into the Zoom comment box. And here we go. And then I will proceed to a more interactive form here. Let me see, chat. Yeah, there's the link. Okay. Well, I'll begin this next segment with the question that David Castro sent me by email. Thank you, David. Thank you for being on the line here. And it's a very short and sweet question. How will you appeal to the conservative voters in District 4? Well, for one thing, not to be too flippant about it, but there are certainly some conservative voters in District 4 that I will probably never appeal to. And those will be the ones that are already big fans of Mr. Christie as well. So that's one part of it. However, I think there are a number of issues on which I really can and do appeal to conservatives. One is conserving the environment. And I'm very much opposed to the Rosemont mine, for one thing. Rosemont mine would be an environmental disaster. It would pollute the air, pollute the water for future generations, no matter how hard they try to draw up a mitigation plan for that thing, it's putting lipstick on a pig. It would just be a disaster. And, you know, uh, Mr. Christie's Republican predecessor, Ray Carroll, was also a staunch opponent of the Rosemont mine. So District 4 residents are in tune, I think, with that attitude of opposing the mine. And Mr. Christie has reversed that entirely. He has been a champion for building the Rosemont mine. And I think largely on economic grounds, and we will return to some more comments about how to grow the economy without destroying the environment in a few minutes. So that's one issue. Another issue where I think I can appeal to conservative voters is one where Supervisor Christie made a very strange statement a few months ago. A resolution came before the Board of Supervisors that was simply to encourage the state legislature and the governor to ratify the Equal Rights Amendment. And you would think that at this stage that would be reasonably uncontroversial, and yet Mr. Christie railed against it, saying that the Equal Rights Amendment is unnecessary because women have already achieved workplace equality. And there was a rather stunned atmosphere in the meeting room when he said that, and he was the only one. Even his fellow Republican supervisor, Allie Miller, voted in favor of that resolution. He was the only one to oppose it, and I think that surveys say that at least 70% of Americans, and that has to include many conservatives, do favor the Equal Rights Amendment. So he's out of step with that, and that's another issue. And then in terms of the response to the pandemic, again, I think his attitudes are out of step. I think that most Americans will prioritize community safety, public health, public safety over the survival of businesses. It's as I said earlier, it's a terrible equation to have to try to navigate. But how do you weigh a business failure? How do you measure it in lives? How do you measure it in lives lost and in lives destroyed due to this terrible illness? And so those are some of the more important issues over which I do think I have the ability to appeal to conservatives and not just to liberal and moderate voters. Now, let me see what else is on.
Thank you for that.
Sure. Yeah. Any follow up to that, David?
No, just some interesting points there that I look forward to following up with regarding Steve Christie.
Okay, great. Let me look at Facebook Live now and see if there's anything to respond to. Aha, thanks, Kristen. That seems to be in tune with what I was just saying. Any questions from Facebook? I've got that window open now. I'm trying to juggle between my my Zoom window and my Facebook Live window, which are, as far from my point of view, they're not totally in sync. But I guess this technology works reasonably well to do it simultaneously on both. If anyone has anything more on Facebook, I'll give you a couple minutes to put that in, because what I want to do next is to play a little video that I made a couple weeks ago and that I posted on YouTube. And again, if these technologies manage to work properly together, I will be able to play it over Zoom, and it will also play from Zoom back to Facebook Live. And I've done this before, and it'll be laggy, but I think the audio at least will come through. So let's give it a try. It's only a couple of minutes long. So here we go. Take a second to get this done. I'm Steve Diamond, a Democratic candidate for County Board of Supervisors in District 4, where no Democrat has run since 1996. For the first time in 24 years, voters have a choice. And what is that choice? It's a choice between my opponent's conservative ideologies in lockstep with Trump and Ducey, and my democratic values, values like honesty, integrity, equity, inclusiveness, and justice for all. It's a choice between raping our environment and polluting our water supply by allowing the Rosemont mine to be constructed, as my opponent champions, and on my part fighting tooth and nail to protect our environment and our water supply for future generations. And it's a choice between outmoded attitudes, like refusing to support the Equal Rights Amendment on the grounds that women have already achieved workplace equality, as my opponent recently asserted, and on my part recognizing that there are severe inequities and injustices baked into our society, our social system. Inequities based on gender, based on skin color, based on economic status, and based on sexual preference. And that it's up to us to do everything that we can to mitigate the injustices and to fix the underlying problems. So yes, in 2020, voters have a real choice. To find out more, please visit my website, votestevediamond.com, where you can donate a few dollars to my grassroots people-powered campaign, where every dollar helps. You can find out more about my positions, and you can sign up to volunteer. Thank you for watching. Okay, I'm back. I hope that played more or less well. It didn't even look very smooth to me, so sorry for the jaggedness. But there you have my little summary of what I think is at stake in this election. Aha. Kristen is asking, what do you have to say about his refusal to wear masks, and what about his statements that border on COVID denial? He said he didn't know anyone who had gotten it, which is a bald-faced lie. Yeah, I'm really dismayed. and by his even just by his refusal to wear a mask and set an example. I mean, if our public officials are not going to be setting the right examples, um, then we're sunk. And obviously, that is a refusal to set an example that starts at the very top with President Trump, and it, to me, is really reprehensible. I was watching, I think I mentioned earlier, the video of a debate between Steve Christie and John Backer, his Republican opponent in the primary. And they did this last week. It was LD14 Republicans, and they're both sitting there, not quite shoulder to shoulder, but both without masks, and they're passing back and forth a hand microphone. With, no hand sanitizer, no nothing, the same hand microphone is being passed back and forth between the two of them. And, if that's not denial, I don't know what is. And it makes absolutely zero sense to me. And that's why I make this contrast between being ideologically driven and being pragmatic and values driven. Because as far as I can tell, it's purely libertarian ideology of, don't tread on me, that informs those kinds of behaviors and those kinds of responses. And I don't get it. I don't get it, and I'm glad that I don't get it. I'm glad that I don't get it, because that to me is it's not even human. It certainly doesn't. Well, now the headlines are going to be Diamond says Christie is an animal. No, I don't mean that. But it doesn't accord with what I consider to be human values and community values and family values, as I keep emphasizing. Okay, who else has something provocative to talk about before I remind myself, Bill, to go back to the economy? All right, back to the economy. Socialism has become a bad word. Socialist has become an accusation thrown at Democrats, tax and spend Democrats. And yet the voters keep talking about things that they would like to get done in the community, like in the case of Pima County, for instance, fixing the roads, and yet they vote against funding for it. Well, mandates to do things without providing funding just don't work. They just don't work. And what goes by socialism is really nothing more or less than people pooling their resources via taxes in order to get things done for the common good, for the benefit of the community as a whole. And so, in the face of voter reluctance to authorize new taxes, for instance, the voters defeated the bond issue that was proposed in 2018 that would have really helped to fund road repair. The only other ways are to expand the tax base so that there are higher revenues from existing tax structures, or to, as the board adopted last year, pay as you go, which means recovering some additional revenues that come about because previous bond issues are being paid down. So the cash flow, without changing the tax structure, the cash flow becomes higher because there is less debt repayment, and also because of economic expansion. Well, one proposal that I'm advancing strongly, which I haven't heard discussed anywhere else, is that economic expansion can happen in several ways. And the way that I'm going to push is by reinvesting in the community. There is institutional spending on large scales happening on the part of big institutions in the city and the county. The county itself is one such institution that spends boatloads of money outside of Arizona. They spend millions of dollars, for instance, on IT procurement and consulting. And I'm looking into what other areas they have large spending in that could conceivably be brought back. Because if money from large institutional spending is spent in the community instead of going outside the county, outside the state, then it multiplies itself. It is spent and respent, and it grows and invigorates the local economy. So the county itself, the university, the various hospital systems, all of these, and even the, well, I don't know how approachable something like a Raytheon would be, or the US Air Force, but even they, I would think, could be approached and lobbied by county government and city government collaborating to direct more of their spending back into this community and to help grow the economy that way. And this would automatically mean more investment in local businesses. And I would really love to see it proceed along the lines of how a model, it's been a model project in Cleveland called the Evergreen Cooperatives that started with this very idea of redirecting institutional spending back into the community. And they used it, among other things, to begin to found a series of worker-owned cooperatives that could take on some of the work that institutions had been spending elsewhere. And one example of that is that the hospital systems agreed to send their laundry business, and hospitals have large requirements for industrial laundry processing. They agreed to send their laundry to a newly formed worker-owned cooperative that does commercial laundry. That's one small example, but it's a way that institutional spending can help invigorate the economy without any tax giveaways, without bringing outside companies that have no real ties to the community, like an Amazon, for instance, and in ways that don't require additional spending, don't require additional taxation. So that's one thing that I wanted to say about the economy. And there was another thing I wanted to say. This is now circling back to Richard Elias, whose memory will be with me, I'm sure, to the end of my days. In one of the last meetings, this also brings in the environment. In one of the last meetings I had with Richard, he shared with me his dream. And this dream is, I say is because it's now my dream, to have a new county park called the Richard Elias Rincon Mountain Park, somewhat along the model of the Tucson Mountain Park, which was begun in 1929 by a purchase of land in the area by the Pima County Board of Supervisors at that time, which went on to become Tucson Mountain Park, Saguaro National Park, west and east. They also bought properties in the Rincon Mountains that became Saguaro National Park East, and the Saguaro Wilderness Area, the Rincon Mountain Wilderness Area, and Pima County has been quietly buying up some previously privately held land in the Reddington Pass area that adjoins or is very close to national forest land that's part of the Rincon Mountain Wilderness Area. They've bought several ranches over the last 15 or 20 years. And Richard's dream was to have all of that consolidated into a new Rincon Mountain Park that would primarily conserve the land and use it for water reclamation, use it for preservation of wildlife habitats, and also be developed to some extent for public use, so that public recreation would be another reason for having that there. And of course, as I said, we already have the Saguaro and the Rincon Mountain Wilderness areas there, but to have more county managed land adjoining that could be managed in a somewhat more public way for public benefit is something that I would love to see happen, and I would love to see it named after Richard. I'm going to choke up now because when I talk about him, it really, I'm so fortunate to have known him and to have had him as a friend and as a supporter. He was in many ways my biggest fan. So anyhow, that's my one of my environmental proposals for the day is the Richard Elias Rincon Mountain Park. Anything else anyone wants to talk about today? I'm going to switch back to my Facebook Live screen to see. Kristen asks, what are some ideas you have for CARES funding? Well, I'm not an expert on what the possibilities are for using that. I haven't really studied that, but I can certainly tell you that in your area of expertise, that I would very much like to see support of affordable public housing, support of renters' rights, and some much better way of dealing with the eviction situation than this about to expire moratorium, which really doesn't help anyone all that much, as you very well know. And if funds can be allocated that would help, you know, it's a difficult situation, because if we just say unilaterally, well, forgive all rents, then what happens to the landlords who can't pay their mortgages? So there has to be some cooperation there and some support, ideally, for the landlords and their mortgages, as well as for the tenants and their rents. You can't really have one without the other. But public housing, affordable housing, should be a public right. I mean, food and shelter and health care and water are minimum requirements without which no one is free to engage in the pursuit of happiness, as the Declaration of Independence states it. So that's one way. If those funds are available for that purpose, I would like to see them used. Just okay. Okay, now David is asking, what are the adverse effects to future county budget due to the pandemic, or does the city take the greater hit? Well, the I think both. I think they both do. The city budget and the county budget are approximately the same size. The city budget's a little bit larger, um, uh, and the let's see, the city revenues come from more from business activity, I think, and the county revenues come more from property taxes. And so the city may very well take a larger hit because of that, because of the way that happens. Then there's also the issue of state money, and that is supposed to come to the counties and the cities, and which the state has been withholding for years. Ever since the 2008 recession, the state of Arizona has begun to sweep funds that were designated for to be redistributed back to local jurisdictions. And they say, oh, we have to keep those here in Phoenix for state purposes. It's illegitimate, and it has hurt the counties particularly badly, and especially in the area of road repair, because a lot of that money is um, what they call HERF funds, which is from the highway usage tax, gasoline tax, and the states held on to that money for years now that should have come to the county. So yeah, I think you're right, David, to suggest that it hits the city somewhat harder than it hits the county, but I don't think it's going to be. I think it's going to be a recession in both cases, and that's one reason why the county passed a minimum budget without holding any extensive budget hearings the way they ordinarily would have. Anything else anyone wants to talk about? Well, I will end then once again with the obligatory appeal for campaign donations. I mean, really, in order to get the word out, which needs to happen in this Republican majority district especially, you know, I need to be able to advertise, make signs, print literature, all kinds of things like that. Even running a very minimal campaign, which I am. I have no professional campaign staff, and I have very little in the way of expenses, but there's more that I would like to be able to do, particularly signs and literature and some more Facebook advertising. So none of that can happen without money. So please, whatever you can give. I think I posted a link earlier, or if you have any trouble finding the right place to go, just go to votestevediamond.com, and there's a big red donate button and some other ways of finding it there. And with that, unless anyone has anything else now, I'm going to thank everyone for being present, and I will wrap it up. Seeing none. Again. Thanks a lot. Thanks very much. Thanks everyone for being here. And stay tuned. There will be more of these meetings coming up. I hope to have special guests of other candidates and local politicians to discuss specific issues. And we'll be going from now through the end of October, I'm sure. So thanks again, and hope to see you again.